Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I used to believe birthdays were quiet milestones, the kind that asked you to look back more than forward. I turned 62 that day, and all I wanted was coffee that stayed hot, a slice of lemon cake, and my husband Leonard sitting across from me, pretending not to fuss over the candles like he always did. We'd been married for 34 years, long enough that silence between us felt normal, even comforting. Or so I thought. The house smelled like vanilla and furniture polish, and I remember smoothing the tablecloth with my palm, thinking how strange it was that a life could be folded into routine so neatly you stopped noticing the seams. Leonard had been restless all morning, too many trips to the window, checking the driveway like he was waiting for a delivery that kept getting lost. When I asked him if he was all right, he smiled too fast and said, "Just excited, big day." His smile didn't reach his eyes. I noticed that, but I told myself not everything needs an explanation. Marriage teaches you which questions to swallow. At exactly 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Leonard's shoulders dropped, like he'd been holding his breath. He stood, wiped his hands on his slacks, and said, "This is part of the surprise." I laughed, light and careless, thinking maybe our daughter had flown in early or one of the neighbors had decided to be social. I stayed seated, candle smoke curling in the air, while he opened the door. What I heard first was not laughter or a familiar voice. It was the shuffle of feet. Then a woman cleared her throat. Then a child whispered, "Is this her?" Leonard stepped aside, and that's when I saw them. A woman about my age, maybe a little younger, holding the hand of a teenage boy. Behind them stood a girl in her 20s, stiff-backed, eyes scanning the room like she was memorizing exits. They all shared Leonard's eyes. That was the first thing that hit me. Genetics is a loud truth when it wants to be. "This is Margaret," Leonard said, gesturing to the woman, "and these are my children, Thomas and Eliza." He said it like he was reading a grocery list. No tremor, no apology, just fact. My name hung in the air unspoken, like an afterthought. I stood up slowly. I remember noticing the way my knees cracked, the way my heart didn't race the way I expected. Shock, I learned later, can be very quiet. Margaret smiled at me with a practiced politeness, the kind you use at funerals or job interviews. The boy stared at the floor. The girl met my eyes with something like defiance, or maybe fear. Leonard finally said my name then, soft and almost fond, like it might cushion the blow. "This is my wife." 30 years. That was the number he used when he started explaining. 30 years ago, before we married, before our house, before the shared bank account and the photo albums, he had another life. He said he hadn't planned it. He said it just happened. He said he thought he could keep the world separate. He said he didn't want to hurt anyone. Each sentence landed like a pebble dropped into deep water. No splash, just ripples I couldn't see the bottom of. I nodded. I smiled. I offered them seats. I heard myself asking if they wanted tea. The part of me that organized school fundraisers and sat through hospital waiting rooms took over. Politeness can be armor if you wear it long enough. Leonard watched me closely, maybe waiting for a scream, a plate thrown, a scene he could later describe as my failure. I gave him none of that. We sat around the table where my cake still waited, half-melted frosting and crooked candles. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and said she'd known about me for years. She said Leonard had always promised he'd tell me when the time was right. The children said nothing. They didn't need to. Their existence was loud enough. I asked Leonard why now, why my birthday. He swallowed and said he didn't want any more secrets. He said he was tired. He said turning 70 had scared him. He wanted everyone together, one family, honest at last. He reached for my hand like this was a reconciliation scene in a movie, like the timing was poetic instead of cruel. I let him hold it. What he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that I had been living with a different kind of knowledge for a very long time. Not the details, not the names or faces, but the truth that something was wrong. 30 years ago, there were phone calls that ended when I entered the room, business trips that didn't add up, a second checking account he said was for investments. I had learned to survive by not pulling at loose threads, but I am not foolish and I am not passive. I just wait. I had found out about Margaret 5 years earlier, not from him, from a tax document misfiled in a folder marked Utilities, a dependent with a different address. I remember sitting on the floor with the paper shaking in my hands, feeling my life tilt. I didn't confront him then. I hired a lawyer instead. Quietly, I learned what patience could buy you. So when Leonard finally finished his confession, when he looked at me with that hopeful, pleading expression, I stood up again. I walked to the sideboard and picked up a small box wrapped in silver paper. It was the one gift I hadn't opened yet. I held it out to him with both hands. "This is for you," I said. My voice was steady. I was saving it. His face softened with relief. He smiled, a real one this time, and took the box like it was a blessing. The room held its breath. Margaret leaned forward. The children watched. Leonard opened the lid. Inside was not what he expected. It was not forgiveness. It was not a watch or a letter or anything sentimental. It was paperwork, neatly stacked, labeled. Divorce filings, copies of property deeds, a flash drive taped to the top. Evidence. 30 years of lies documented with the same care he'd used to hide them. "I know," I said gently. "I've known longer than you think." The silence that followed was complete. Leonard's mouth opened, then closed. Margaret's hand flew to her chest. The boy looked up for the first time, confusion written all over his face. The girl's eyes narrowed, not at me, but at Leonard. Leonard finally said my name then, soft and almost fond, like it might cushion the blow. "This is my wife." I wished them all well. I meant it. Then I blew out the candles myself, even though they'd burned low, and I said, "This birthday is about honesty, finally." The silence after I spoke felt heavier than any shouting match ever could. Leonard's hands trembled as he held the papers, the silver wrapping sliding onto the floor like shed skin. For a moment, he looked very old. Not the dignified kind of old that comes with wisdom, but the kind that comes when illusions finally collapse under their own weight. Margaret's eyes darted between us, and I could see her recalculating everything she thought she knew about the man standing beside her. That was when I realized something important. I was not the only woman he had lied to. I was just the one who had prepared. Leonard tried to speak. My name came out of his mouth like a question. I held up my hand, not angrily, just firmly, the way I used to stop our daughter from running into the street when she was little. "No," I said. "You've talked enough for one lifetime." My voice, the silence after I spoke, felt heavier than any shouting match ever could. Leonard's hands trembled as he held the papers, the silver wrapping sliding onto the floor like shed skin. For a moment, he looked very old. Not the dignified kind of old that comes with wisdom, but the kind that comes when illusions finally collapse under their own weight. Margaret's eyes darted between us, and I could see her recalculating everything she thought she knew about the man standing beside her. That was when I realized something important. I was not the only woman he had lied to. I was just the one who had prepared. Leonard tried to speak. My name came out of his mouth like a question. I held up my hand, not angrily, just firmly, the way I used to stop our daughter from running into the street when she was little. "No," I said. "You've talked enough for one lifetime." My voice surprised even me. It was calm. Calm is powerful when everyone expects you to break. I turned to Margaret then. "You're welcome to sit," I told her, gesturing to the chair she'd already been occupying like a visitor afraid to leave a mark. "This isn't your fault. You were told a story too." Her shoulders sagged at that, and she nodded slowly. tears welling but not falling. There is a particular grief that comes with realizing you've built your life on borrowed truth. I recognized it instantly because I'd been carrying it for years. Thomas, the boy, looked at Leonard with a kind of wounded curiosity. "Dad?" he asked, and that single word cut deeper than anything else. Leonard reached for him instinctively, but the boy leaned back, unsure. Eliza crossed her arms and stared at the floor, jaw tight. She looked like someone who had suspected this day would come and hated being right. I sat back down at the table and poured myself some coffee. My hand was steady. I remember noticing that, too. 34 years of marriage teaches you how to function even when your insides feel rearranged. "I'm not throwing anyone out," I said, "but this conversation is changing." I slid the cake toward the center. "You can sit or you can leave, but you will listen." Leonard lowered himself into the chair across from me. For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't look like the man in charge of the room. He looked like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. I told them everything then, not with venom, not with drama, but with clarity. I told them when I found the document. I told them about the lawyer, about the quiet preparations. I told them that I had grieved the marriage years ago, privately, without spectacle, that what they were witnessing now was not the explosion, but the echo. Margaret covered her mouth with her hand. "He told me you were distant," she said softly, "that you didn't care anymore." I smiled sadly. "I cared enough to protect myself," I replied. "That's not distance, that's survival." Finally, Leonard spoke. "Why didn't you say anything?" His voice cracked, and I almost laughed at the audacity of it. Almost. "Because," I said, "because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought you were safe. And now I have." Truth doesn't always need to be announced. Sometimes it waits patiently for its moment. The children asked questions then, careful ones. How long had I known, whether I hated them, whether any of this meant their father loved them less? I answered honestly. I told them no, I didn't hate them. They were innocent. I told them their father's love for them was real, even if his honesty wasn't. And I told them that families built on lies eventually have to rebuild, one truth at a time, even if the foundation cracks. Leonard started to cry. I'd seen him cry before, at funerals, once when our dog died, quietly in the dark. This was different. This was the sound of a man realizing he could not talk his way out of consequences. He apologized again and again to everyone in the room, his words tripping over each other. I let him finish. Apologies are not currency. They don't buy back time. When the conversation ended, I told Leonard he should pack a bag. Not angrily, practically. I had already arranged temporary housing for myself if I needed it, but legally the house was mine. He knew it now. He nodded, defeated, and stood. Margaret stood too, uncertainty written across her face. "We'll go," she said. "All of us." I shook my head. "The kids can stay if they want. They're welcome. This isn't their mess." Thomas looked hopeful. Eliza looked conflicted. They chose to leave with their mother, and I respected that. The door closed behind them with a soft finality that surprised me. No slam, no drama, just an ending. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet. Then I laughed, not hysterically, just a short, breathy laugh that came from somewhere deep. I had survived the moment I used to imagine would destroy me. That night I slept better than I had in years. The house felt different, lighter, as if it had been holding its breath too. In the days that followed, the fallout arrived in waves. Phone calls from Leonard, long messages I didn't read, a letter from Margaret, apologizing for her part in the secrecy, thanking me for my kindness to her children. I wrote back once, briefly, kindly, then I let it go. Our daughter flew in a week later. I told her everything before Leonard could spin his version. She cried, then she got angry, then she hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs might crack. "I'm proud of you," she said, and that was when the last of the weight lifted. Approval isn't something you should need from your child, but in that moment, it mattered. The divorce was not easy, but it was clean. Preparation has a way of smoothing sharp edges. Leonard didn't fight much. He didn't have the energy. Reputation has a cost when it finally catches up to you. Friends took sides quietly. Some faded away. Others surprised me by staying. I learned which relationships were built on convenience and which on truth. Months passed. I redecorated the living room. I planted a garden where Leonard used to park his second car. I took a trip alone for the first time in my life and discovered I liked my own company more than I expected. Healing, I learned, is not loud. It happens in small, ordinary choices that add up to freedom. One afternoon, Thomas wrote to me, just a short email. He said he hoped I was well. He said he understood now that none of this was my doing. He said he admired how I handled things. I cried then, quietly, not from pain, but from the strange grace of being seen clearly by someone who owed me nothing. On my next birthday, I didn't bake a cake. I went out to dinner with friends who knew the whole story and loved me anyway. I raised a glass and made a toast. To truth, I said, even when it arrives late. They clinked their glasses, and for the first time in a long time, I felt fully present in my own life. If there is a lesson in all of this, it's not about revenge or cleverness. It's about patience and self-respect. It's about understanding that smiles can be shields and silence can be strategy, and that sometimes the most powerful gift you can give yourself is the truth wrapped neatly, waiting for the right moment. In the weeks after Leonard moved out, I learned that silence has layers. There was the quiet of the house at night, unfamiliar but not frightening. There was the silence of my phone, no longer buzzing with his habitual check-ins that I'd once mistaken for care. And then there was the deeper silence, the one inside me, where anger had lived for so long that its absence felt like a hollow ache. I let myself sit with that ache. I didn't rush to fill it with noise or explanations. I had spent decades adjusting myself around someone else's secrets. This time, I wanted to hear my own thoughts clearly. People assume betrayal ends in rage. Sometimes it does, but more often it ends in clarity. That clarity came to me one morning while I was folding laundry, of all things. Leonard's shirts were still in the closet, waiting to be sorted for donation or disposal. I held one up, blue with thin white stripes, the one he wore to our anniversary dinners. I realized I didn't feel hatred. I felt finished. And being finished is a kind of peace that doesn't ask for permission. Margaret called me about a month later. I let it go to voicemail at first, then listened to her message twice before calling back. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. She said the children were struggling. She said Leonard had moved into a short-term rental and was trying, awkwardly, to explain himself. She didn't ask me for anything specific, just said she needed to talk to someone who understood. I surprised myself by agreeing to meet her for coffee. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe on a Tuesday afternoon, two women bound together by a man who had failed us both. She looked tired, older than when I'd first seen her. There is something about truth that ages you quickly, especially when it strips away illusions you relied on to survive. She apologized again. I accepted it, not because it was owed, but because forgiveness is lighter than resentment. We talked about the children, about how hard it is to explain adult choices to young hearts. We did not talk about Leonard much. He had already taken up enough space in both our lives. Before we left, Margaret reached across the table and took my hand. "You were kinder than you had to be," she said. I shook my head. "No," I replied, "I was kinder than I used to be to myself." That was the truth, and saying it out loud felt like closing a circle. Leonard, on the other hand, did not find closure so easily. He sent letters this time, handwritten, as if cursive might soften the past. He apologized, he explained, he reminisced. I read the first one carefully, the second quickly, and the third not at all. I returned them unopened. There are conversations that end not with words, but with boundaries. This was one of them. Our daughter struggled in her own way. She loved her father despite everything, and she loved me fiercely. Watching her reconcile those two truths was painful. I reminded her gently that she didn't have to choose sides, that loving him didn't mean excusing him, that loving me didn't require anger on my behalf. We talked more honestly than we ever had before. Betrayal, oddly enough, stripped our relationship down to something stronger. Truth does that if you let it. Spring came, and with it small rituals that belonged only to me. Morning walks without checking the clock, cooking meals Leonard never liked, rearranging furniture just because I could. Each choice felt insignificant on its own, but together they built a new rhythm, a life no longer shaped around compromise that only flowed one way. Then, unexpectedly, Eliza reached out. She asked if we could talk. I hesitated, then agreed. We met in a park, neutral ground. She didn't waste time. She asked why I stayed married to a man like her father for so long. The question wasn't accusatory, it was searching. I told her the truth, that love doesn't always announce when it turns into habit, that fear can disguise itself as loyalty, that women of my generation were taught endurance was virtue. She listened carefully, nodding. "I don't want that kind of life," she said quietly. "Good," I replied, "then this pain will have taught you something worth keeping." She hugged me before she left. It was awkward, brief, sincere. I watched her walk away and felt a strange sense of relief. The story Leonard told himself about being a good man with complicated circumstances was unraveling, thread by thread, not through my anger, but through honest reflection from the people who mattered most. By the time summer arrived, the divorce was finalized. I marked the day not with celebration, but with intention. I drove to the coast alone and sat by the water, letting the wind tangle my hair. I thought about the woman I had been at 30, hopeful and trusting. I didn't judge her. She did the best she could with what she knew. I thought about the woman I was now, steadier, quieter, awake. I thanked her for waiting until I was ready. Leonard tried one last time to speak with me in person. He showed up unannounced, standing on the porch like a ghost of a life already buried. I didn't invite him in. We talked through the screen door. He said he was lonely. He said he missed me. He said he'd made a terrible mistake. I believed him, all of it, and I still said no, because remorse does not rebuild trust, and loneliness is not love rediscovered. When he left, I locked the door gently and felt no urge to look back. What surprised me most was not how much I lost, but how much I gained. I gained sleep, I gained honesty, I gained a sense of authorship over my own story. I learned that smiling doesn't always mean surrender, and patience doesn't always mean weakness. Sometimes it means choosing the moment that honors you best. If you're listening to this and you're in the middle of something that feels impossible, hear this clearly. You don't have to explode to reclaim your power. You don't have to rush. You don't even have to confront immediately. You just have to respect yourself enough to prepare for the truth whenever it arrives. And when it does, you'll know what to do. I didn't destroy my marriage. The truth revealed what had already been broken, and in the quiet that followed, I finally heard my own life calling me forward. There's a strange afterlife to betrayal that no one really talks about. The event itself feels like the climax, the moment everything burns down. But what comes after is quieter and longer. It's made of ordinary days that ask you again and again who you are now that the truth has taken away your old excuses. That was the season I entered after Leonard finally stopped trying to reach me. No more letters, no unexpected visits, just space. Real space. And space, I learned, can be intimidating when you're not used to hearing yourself think. At first, I filled my days with tasks, practical ones. I reorganized the garage. I updated paperwork. I replaced light bulbs that had been flickering for years because Leonard always said he'd get to them. There was a small, private satisfaction in doing things he used to postpone. Each completed task felt like reclaiming a square inch of my life. Independence doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up disguised as competence. But beneath the productivity, something else was stirring. Grief. Not for Leonard exactly, but for the version of my life I had believed in, for the future I'd pictured growing old into, even if it had already been thinning around the edges. One afternoon, that grief caught me off guard in the cereal aisle of the grocery store. I stood staring at two nearly identical boxes, suddenly unable to decide, because for decades Leonard had always had a preference. That realization hit harder than any argument ever had. I abandoned the cart and went home empty-handed, sat at the kitchen table, and let myself cry properly for the first time since my birthday. Crying didn't undo my resolve, it softened it. There is strength in allowing yourself to mourn without romanticizing what you lost. I didn't miss the lies. I didn't miss the waiting. I missed the idea of shared history, meaning shared truth. Once I named that, the grief loosened its grip. People started treating me differently, too. Some with pity, others with admiration that felt uncomfortable, like praise for surviving something I never volunteered for. I learned to accept neither too deeply. Pity shrinks you. Admiration can trap you in a role. I didn't want to be the strong woman people whispered about. I wanted to be a whole one. One evening, while sorting through old photographs, I found a picture from our early years. Leonard had his arm around me, both of us laughing at something outside the frame. I studied my younger face closely. I looked open, unguarded. I didn't tear the photo up. I didn't put it back either. I placed it in a separate box, labeled simply, Then. Not everything from the past needs to be destroyed. Some things just need to be acknowledged for what they were, and nothing more. Unexpectedly, a few people from Leonard's extended family reached out. Quiet messages, careful words. Some apologized for not seeing what was happening. Others admitted they had suspected but didn't want to interfere. I thanked them without bitterness. Silence, I had learned, is contagious. So is courage. You never know who is watching you decide to finally speak. The most difficult conversation came from within. Late at night, when the house was dark and my thoughts grew louder, I had to confront my own role in staying, not to assign blame, but to understand. I asked myself hard questions. Why did I accept partial truths for so long? Why did I equate peace with avoidance? The answers were uncomfortable, but they were mine, and owning them felt strangely empowering. Accountability, when self-directed, is not punishment. It's clarity. I began seeing a therapist, something Leonard had always dismissed as unnecessary. In those sessions, I learned that intuition doesn't shout, it whispers, and when you ignore it long enough, it goes quiet to protect itself. Mine had been quiet for years. Therapy helped me listen again, to myself, to my body, to the subtle sense of wrongness I had once learned to override. Around this time, Thomas sent another message. He told me he'd started college nearby. He said he hoped it wasn't inappropriate, but he wondered if we could have lunch sometime. I sat with that request for a long time before replying. Then I said yes. We met at a small diner, neutral and bright. He was nervous. So was I. We talked about school, about books, about nothing too heavy at first. Eventually, he thanked me. Not for staying, not for leaving, but for telling the truth without cruelty. He said, "It changed how I think about men." I nodded. "Good," I replied softly. "That means something good came out of this." Walking home afterward, I realized something important. Leonard's greatest fear had always been exposure. Mine, it turned out, had been transformation. And yet here I was, changed and still standing, still myself, but clearer. Autumn arrived gently. Leaves gathered in corners of the yard like forgotten thoughts. I hosted dinner for friends one evening, something I hadn't done in years without Leonard orchestrating the guest list. The conversation was lively, honest. At one point, someone asked if I ever missed being married. I thought about it carefully before answering. I said, "I miss partnership, but not at the cost of myself." The room fell quiet for a moment, then someone raised their glass. It wasn't a sad silence, it was a respectful one. I started volunteering at a local community center, mentoring younger women navigating career and family choices. I never told my full story unless asked. I focused on listening, on reminding them that patience should never require self-erasure, that love without truth is just performance. Seeing their faces as they absorbed that felt like stitching meaning back into my own experiences. Sometimes, late at night, I still wondered how Leonard was doing, not with longing, with curiosity. That told me everything I needed to know. When you stop imagining reconciliation and start imagining distance with neutrality, you've crossed an important threshold. On the anniversary of my birthday, I returned to the same table, the same room, now rearranged and brighter. I lit one candle this time, just one. I didn't make a wish. I didn't need to. I already knew what I wanted, and I was living it. I blew it out slowly and whispered, "Thank you." Not to Leonard, not to fate, to myself, for waiting, for preparing, for choosing dignity over denial. Betrayal may arrive without warning, but healing is something you build deliberately, brick by brick, truth by truth. And in the end, the life you stand inside may look nothing like the one you planned, but it will finally belong to you. By the time winter settled in, I had stopped measuring my life in before and after. The line had blurred, not because the past no longer mattered, but because it no longer ruled me. There were mornings when I still woke up and reached instinctively toward the other side of the bed, then smiled at the empty space instead of flinching. Freedom doesn't always feel triumphant. Sometimes it feels quiet and almost ordinary, and that, I learned, is its greatest gift. The holidays were my first real test. For decades, Leonard and I had hosted the same gathering, the same menu, the same predictable rituals. I considered canceling everything. Instead, I changed it. I invited fewer people, I cooked different food, I told everyone ahead of time that I was doing things my way this year. No explanations, no apologies. The evening was smaller, warmer, and surprisingly joyful. I realized then how often tradition is just habit wearing a festive disguise. After dinner, as we sat with tea and low music playing, one of my friends asked how I had known Leonard was lying all those years ago. The question wasn't accusatory, it was curious, reflective. I answered honestly. "I didn't always know," I said, "but my body did." They looked puzzled, so I explained. The tension headaches, the tight chest when he traveled, the constant low-level anxiety I had chalked up to being a wife, a mother, a responsible adult. We are taught to distrust our instincts when they inconvenience other people. That lesson costs us dearly. In January, I did something I'd never done before. I signed up for a writing class. Not because I wanted to publish anything, but because I wanted to put words to experiences I'd spent years swallowing. The first assignment was simple: write about a turning point. I sat at my desk for a long time before starting. Then I wrote about the box, the silver paper, the weight of truth in my hands. When I read it aloud to the group, my voice shook, but I didn't stop. The room was silent when I finished, not awkward, attentive. One woman wiped her eyes, another nodded slowly. Sharing my story didn't drain it of power, It multiplied it. Leonard remained mostly absent, which was exactly what I needed. Occasionally, I'd hear about him through our data. He was trying, he was lonely, he was reflective. I hoped that was true. Growth doesn't require proximity. Sometimes distance is the only soil it can grow in. One afternoon, Margaret sent me a message, just a photo. Thomas and Eliza standing together, smiling stiffly at some family event I wasn't part of. Beneath it, she wrote, "We're finding our way." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I typed back, "I'm glad," and I meant it. Closure doesn't always come with conversation. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the knowledge that you are no longer entangled in outcomes you cannot control. As spring approached again, I noticed how differently I moved through the world. I made decisions faster, not recklessly, but without the constant internal committee meeting. I trusted myself. That trust had been eroded slowly over decades of accommodating someone else's contradictions. Rebuilding it felt like learning to walk on a leg that had been asleep for years, unsteady at first, then stronger. I ran into Leonard unexpectedly at the pharmacy one afternoon. He looked startled, then hopeful, then uncertain, all in the span of a few seconds. We stood in the aisle with cough syrup and vitamins between us like neutral witnesses. He asked how I was. I told him the truth. "I'm well," I said. He nodded, swallowing. He said he was glad. I believed him. When he asked if we could talk sometime, I shook my head gently. I don't think that would be kind. Not to him, to me. He looked hurt, but he accepted it. Growth is recognizing when an ending has already done its work. Later that day, I thought about how different that encounter would have felt a year earlier. I would have rehearsed it, feared it. Now it was just another moment that passed without leaving a bruise. That's how you know healing has taken hold. The writing class became a small anchor in my week. Each story I wrote peeled back another layer of who I was before compromise became second nature. I wrote about my mother, who taught me to keep the peace at any cost. I wrote about my daughter, who taught me that love could survive honesty. I wrote about myself, learning, finally, to stay. One evening after class, the instructor pulled me aside. She said my voice was steady, that my restraint made the emotion land harder. I smiled at that. I had spent so long being told I was too calm, too controlled. Now that same quality was being recognized as strength. Context, I realized, changes everything. I began to imagine a future that wasn't defined by reaction. I thought about traveling more, about mentoring full-time, about what kind of partnership I might want someday, if any. The thought no longer scared me. I had learned that being alone was not the same as being abandoned, and that lesson was priceless. On the anniversary of the divorce, I took the box out again, the actual one, the silver paper long since wrinkled, the edges soft. Inside, the documents were no longer relevant. They had done their job. I held the empty box in my hands and felt a strange affection for it. It wasn't a symbol of revenge. It was a symbol of readiness, of choosing myself without spectacle. If there is one thing I could tell the woman I used to be, it's this. You don't need permission to protect your dignity. You don't need proof beyond what your heart already knows, and you don't need to explain your timing to anyone. Survival is not cowardice. Sometimes it's strategy. The life I live now is quieter, but it is honest. There are no hidden rooms, no second stories running parallel to my own. Every relationship I keep is one I can look at directly. That clarity is the reward no one talks about. It's not flashy, it doesn't trend, but it lasts. And when I look back on that birthday now, I don't see humiliation. I see precision. I see a woman who waited until the truth walked through the door on its own legs, then met it standing tall. I see the moment everything shifted, not because I raised my voice, but because I finally honored it. By the time the second summer arrived, I no longer introduced myself as someone who had been betrayed. That chapter existed, but it was no longer the headline of my identity. I had learned how easily pain can become a story you keep retelling until it traps you inside it. I wanted something else now, not forgetting, but integrating, letting the experience inform me without defining me. The community center asked if I would lead a small discussion group for women navigating midlife transitions. I hesitated before saying yes, not because I doubted my ability, but because I understood the responsibility. When you speak from experience, people listen differently. They project their own fears and hopes onto your words. I agreed on one condition: honesty without drama. No villains, no saints, just truth. The group filled quickly. Our first meeting was held in a plain room with mismatched chairs and a faint smell of coffee. We sat in a circle. Some women spoke immediately. Others clutched their notebooks like shields. When it was my turn, I didn't tell my whole story. I told them this instead: that staying and leaving both require courage, but only one requires you to abandon yourself. That sentence hung in the air longer than I expected. A few women nodded. One wiped her eyes. I knew then that my life, in its broken and rebuilt form, had become useful, not as a warning, as permission. After those meetings, I often walked home slowly, letting the conversation settle. There is something sacred about being trusted with other people's truths. It reminded me how carefully we should handle our own. Leonard had handled mine carelessly for decades. I refused to do the same with anyone else's. Our daughter came to stay for a week that summer. We spent long afternoons talking on the porch, the kind of conversations that wander and circle back. She admitted she was afraid of repeating her father's patterns, of not seeing red flags in time. I told her fear can sharpen your awareness if you let it, but it can also harden you. Don't choose partners to avoid pain, I said. Choose them to build truth. She leaned her head on my shoulder like she used to when she was little, and for a moment, time folded in on itself. Leonard called once during that week. I didn't answer. Later, my daughter asked if that made me uncomfortable. I shook my head. No, I said, it just means I know what I'm willing to reopen. Boundaries, I had learned, are not walls. They're doors you control. I began traveling more deliberately, not to escape, but to experience. I visited a small coastal town where no one knew my name or my history. I walked along the water at dawn, watching the horizon change color. I felt small in the best way. Betrayal shrinks your world. Wonder expands it again. One evening, sitting alone at a seaside cafe, I overheard a couple arguing softly at the next table. Familiar tension, familiar phrases. I felt the old urge to analyze, to intervene, to recognize myself in their dynamic. Instead, I paid my bill and left. Compassion does not require self-exposure. That was a lesson it took me decades to learn. Back home, a letter arrived from Leonard, the first in months. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the counter and let it sit there for 3 days. When I finally read it, it was shorter than his earlier ones. No justifications, no nostalgia, just acknowledgement. He wrote that he understood now that the harm he caused was not just the lie, but the years of making me doubt my own perception. He said he was sorry for that most of all. I believed him, and I still didn't respond. Apologies can be real without requiring reconciliation. That same week, the writing instructor encouraged me to submit one of my pieces to a small literary journal. I laughed it off at first. Exposure had once been something to fear. Now it felt like a choice. I submitted it. A month later, I received an email saying they wanted to publish it. I read the message 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to feel it fully. My story, once hidden and heavy, would now exist outside of me, touching strangers I would never meet. That felt like alchemy. When the piece was published, a woman I'd never heard of wrote to me. She said she had read it late at night, sitting in her car, afraid to go inside her house. She said my restraint gave her courage. I cried when I read that, not because I felt important, but because I felt connected. Pain isolates. Truth connects. There were still moments of anger. Healing is not linear, no matter how neatly people like to package it. Sometimes a song would come on the radio, or a phrase Leonard used to say would echo in my head, and I would feel the old heat rise. But it passed more quickly now. Anger, when not fed, burns itself out. One afternoon, Thomas stopped by unexpectedly. He was taller than I remembered, more confident. He said he was in town and wondered if he could see me. We sat in the garden I had planted where Leonard's car once stood. He told me about his studies, his plans. Then he said something that stayed with me. "Watching you leave changed what I think strength looks like," he said. "You didn't try to win, you just refused to lose yourself." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Remember that," I told him, "for the rest of your life." As autumn approached again, I felt a sense of completion settling in. Not an ending, a resolution. The story no longer demanded my attention. It had been told, lived, integrated. I could carry it lightly now. If I have learned anything through all of this, it's that dignity is quiet work. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand applause. It shows up in preparation, in patience, in knowing when to smile and when to walk away. The box I gave Leonard was never about humiliation. It was about alignment between what I knew and what I was finally ready to claim. I am not the woman I was when I married him. I am not even the woman I was on that birthday. I am someone else now, someone who knows that truth delayed is not truth denied. It waits, and when it arrives, you can meet it with chaos or with clarity. I chose clarity. And that choice, more than anything Leonard ever gave or took from me, is the life I now stand inside. The longer I lived inside my new life, the more I understood that closure isn't a door that slams shut. It's a hallway you walk down slowly, sometimes turning back to look at old rooms without going inside them again. I had reached a place where the memories no longer ambushed me. They arrived politely, like distant relatives you greet, acknowledge, and then let pass. One quiet morning, I found myself rereading my published piece online. I hadn't done that before. When it first came out, I skimmed it once and closed the page, afraid of reopening something raw. This time was different. I read it like it belonged to someone else. I noticed the restraint, the pauses, the places where I had chosen not to explain myself. That, I realized, was the truest sign of healing. I no longer needed the reader to side with me. The truth could stand on its own. The discussion group at the community center grew. New faces, new stories. One woman, barely 40, said she felt foolish for even considering leaving her marriage because nothing big had happened yet. No affairs, no dramatic betrayals, just a constant dullness. I looked at her and said something I wish someone had told me years ago. You don't need catastrophe to justify your clarity. Her shoulders dropped as if she'd been carrying a weight she didn't know she could set down. After the meeting, she walked with me to my car and thanked me again. I drove home thinking about how many lives stay paused, waiting for permission that never comes. Leonard had used that hesitation to his advantage for decades. He didn't need me to be blind. He only needed me to be unsure. That thought no longer made me angry. It made me aware. Awareness is the antidote. My daughter called one evening, her voice tight. She had confronted Leonard about something small, a half-truth he'd slipped into conversation out of habit. She said she'd felt the old confusion rise, the instinct to doubt herself instead of him. "I heard your voice in my head," she told me, telling me to trust what I noticed. I closed my eyes and breathed in slowly. That, I thought, is how cycles break. Not with confrontation alone, but with language passed down differently. I still kept my distance from Leonard, but I stopped bracing myself for his shadow. If I saw his name somewhere, it didn't quicken my pulse. That neutrality felt like a quiet triumph. There is a moment in healing when indifference replaces vigilance. That moment is freedom. One afternoon, while sorting through old files, I came across our wedding album. Thick pages, glossy photos. I sat on the floor and opened it carefully. I expected pain. What I felt instead was tenderness. Not for him, but for us as we were then. Two people making promises with limited information, believing love would fill the gaps. I closed the album and put it back on the shelf. Not hidden, not discarded, just placed where it belonged. That night, I dreamed about the box again. Not the confrontation, just the object itself, empty, resting on a table in sunlight. I woke up feeling calm. Dreams, I've learned, lag behind waking life. They catch up when they can. Autumn deepened. I hosted another dinner, this time inviting a mix of old friends and new acquaintances from the writing class and the community center. Different worlds overlapping. The conversation flowed easily. At one point, someone asked how we all knew each other, and I smiled. Through truth, I said simply. It sounded almost abstract, but it felt precise. Later, as I washed dishes alone, I thought about how Leonard had once told me I was too private, too contained. He said it like a flaw. Now I understood it differently. Privacy is not secrecy, it's discernment. I had learned when to speak and when to hold, when to wait, when to act. That discernment had saved me. Margaret sent a message around that time, telling me she and Leonard were separating permanently. Not angrily, factually. She said the children were adjusting. She didn't ask for advice. She didn't need it. She just wanted me to know. I wished her well, and meant it. Forgiveness, I had learned, does not require continued involvement. It requires release. There was a moment, late one evening, when I realized I hadn't thought about Leonard all day, not once. No background hum, no memory tugging at my sleeve. The absence startled me. Then it settled into something warm. Peace is not loud when it arrives. It just stays. In the writing class, we were asked to write about legacy. I didn't write about marriage or betrayal. I wrote about the women who would come after me, about what it means to model self-respect without bitterness, about how strength can look like preparation, patience, and one well-timed decision. When I read it aloud, my voice didn't shake this time. It didn't need to. After class, the instructor asked if I'd consider turning my pieces into a longer work someday. I told her maybe. I wasn't in a hurry. Stories don't ripen faster because you push them. They ripen because you let them breathe. I spent more time alone, but never lonely. I learned the difference. Loneliness is a hunger for connection. Solitude is a choice to hear yourself. I had starved myself of that choice for too long. Now it felt like nourishment. If someone had told me years ago that the life waiting on the other side of betrayal would be quieter but fuller, I might not have believed them. Pain distorts perspective. It makes you think the noise is proof of life. It isn't. Stillness can be alive too. The greatest gift this experience gave me wasn't independence, it was integrity, the alignment between what I felt, what I knew, and what I finally did. That alignment is rare, and once you have it, you protect it fiercely. I didn't win against Leonard. That framing no longer fits. I won myself back, and that victory does not require an audience. By the time winter returned again, it felt less like a season and more like a mirror. The shorter days invited reflection, whether I wanted it or not. I found myself sitting by the window in the early evenings, watching the light fade, not with sadness, but with attentiveness. There is a kind of wisdom that comes when you stop rushing toward what's next and allow yourself to notice where you are. I had stopped telling my story as a cautionary tale. When people asked about my past now, I didn't lead with betrayal. I spoke about resilience, about patience, about the quiet power of preparation. The story had shifted shape, and so had I. Trauma, when tended carefully, does not have to calcify into identity. It can become context. One afternoon, while volunteering at the center, a woman pulled me aside after our session. She said she was planning to confront her husband that night about something she discovered. Her hands were shaking. She asked me what I thought she should say. I looked at her carefully and answered with the only honest response I had learned to trust. "Say what you know," I told her, "and decide beforehand what you're willing to accept." She nodded, exhaled, and thanked me. I watched her walk away and hoped she would be gentle with herself, no matter how the conversation went. That night, I thought about how much energy I had once spent rehearsing conversations that never happened, practicing restraint instead of resolution. The box had not just been an object, it had been a decision, a moment where preparation met timing. That realization stayed with me. My daughter invited me to visit her for a long weekend. We cooked together, laughed easily, talked late into the night. At one point, she asked if I ever regretted waiting so long to act. The question was careful, loving. I considered it honestly. "No," I said. "I acted when I was ready to act, without losing myself. Readiness is not weakness, it is alignment." She smiled at that, and I saw relief flicker across her face. Children often carry their parents' unresolved questions longer than we realize. Offering her that clarity felt like another quiet repair. Leonard remained a distant figure, mentioned occasionally, neutrally. He had stopped trying to rewrite the past. That, in its own way, felt like accountability. I didn't need more than that. Closure does not require agreement, it requires acceptance. I continued writing, not with urgency, but with devotion. Each piece felt like a conversation with my former selves. I honored them without letting them drive. That balance took time. Healing always does. One evening, sorting through a drawer, I found the flash drive from the box, the evidence, the timeline, the truth preserved in files and folders. I held it for a long moment, then deleted everything. Not out of denial, out of completion. The proof had served its purpose. I no longer needed to carry it. As I dropped the empty flash drive into the trash, I felt a surprising lightness. Letting go of evidence felt like letting go of the need to justify myself. I didn't need records anymore. I had my life. The holidays came and went quietly. No drama, no forced cheer, just warmth. I realized then how much peace I had once mistaken for boredom. Peace, I learned, is spacious. It leaves room for breath. Sometimes, late at night, I still reflected on the woman Leonard had hidden for 30 years, on the children who grew up in parallel to my own life. I felt sadness for all of us, not bitterness, sadness for time lost to secrecy. But sadness, unlike resentment, doesn't poison what comes next. It simply acknowledges what cannot be changed. The biggest change, though, was internal. I no longer explained my boundaries. I no longer softened my truth to make it easier to swallow. I spoke plainly, kindly, firmly. That combination had once seemed impossible. Now it felt natural. One afternoon, while walking through the garden, I noticed how much it had grown. The plants had filled in, covering the space where Leonard's car once stood. Roots had taken hold. Life had adapted. I smiled at the metaphor without overthinking it. Growth doesn't need commentary. I was invited to speak at a small local event about personal reinvention. I almost declined, then accepted. Not to perform, but to witness. I told the audience that reinvention isn't about becoming someone new. It's about returning to who you were before you learned to disappear. The room was quiet. I recognized that silence. It was the sound of recognition. Afterward, a man approached me, older, nervous. He said he had been lying to his wife for years about something he thought was too late to confess. He asked me if I thought honesty would destroy everything. I met his eyes and answered carefully. "Dishonesty already has," I said. "Truth just reveals it." He nodded slowly. Whether he would act, I didn't know, but the seed had been planted. As the year turned, I felt something settle into place. Not triumph, not pride, certainty. The kind that doesn't need reinforcement. I had faced the worst day I once imagined and discovered I was still capable of building a good life afterward. That knowledge cannot be taken from you. If I could distill everything I've learned into one truth, it would be this. Patience is not the same as permission. You can wait without surrendering. You can smile without agreeing. You can love without abandoning yourself. And when the moment comes, you can choose yourself without apology. That birthday no longer feels like a wound. It feels like a hinge, the point where everything turned, quietly, decisively. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand understanding. I simply offered the truth, boxed and ready, and stepped into the life waiting on the other side of it. As the years quietly rearranged themselves around me, I realized something unexpected. The story was no longer asking to be told, it was asking to be lived. There's a point in recovery where reflection becomes repetition and wisdom asks you to step forward instead of circling back. I felt myself reaching that point, not with urgency, but with readiness. I began to notice how often people sought certainty where none could be given. They wanted guarantees, proof that choosing themselves wouldn't cost too much, proof that truth would land gently, proof that loss would be followed by something better. I had learned there are no such guarantees. What there is, though, is alignment, and alignment, once felt, becomes non-negotiable. One afternoon, while shelving books at the community center, I overheard two women talking quietly. One said she felt selfish for wanting more honesty in her marriage. The other told her she should be grateful for what she had. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not anger, recognition. I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. But later, when one of them approached me privately, I told her this. Gratitude and self-betrayal are not the same thing. She stared at me, startled. Then she nodded slowly. Sometimes the right sentence arrives at the right time, and that's enough. I spent more time with my daughter that year, watching her navigate her own adulthood with a level of self-awareness I didn't have at her age. She asked questions I never would have dared to ask. She named discomfort without apologizing for it. Watching her felt like witnessing a generational correction. My silence had not been in vain. It had simply needed translation. Leonard faded further into the background of my life. Not dramatically, just naturally, like a character whose role had ended. Occasionally, I would hear updates through mutual acquaintances. He was quieter now, more careful. I hoped that meant he was learning, but I no longer felt responsible for the outcome of his lessons. There was a moment, late one evening, when I realized I had forgiven him fully. Not because he deserved it, but because I was tired of carrying his choices with me. Forgiveness, I learned, is not reconciliation, it's release. And release creates space. That space filled with small joys, morning light through clean windows, conversations that didn't require translation, decisions made without second-guessing myself. I began to trust my first instinct again. That felt like recovering a language I once spoke fluently. I was asked to mentor a younger woman through a particularly difficult separation. She wanted scripts, strategies, step-by-step plans. I offered what I could, but eventually I told her the truth. No plan will protect you from grief, I said, but clarity will protect you from regret. She cried when I said that, not because it scared her, but because it resonated. Clarity is demanding, but it is fair. One day, sorting through old mail, I found a birthday card Leonard had given me years before. Inside, he had written about forever, about honesty. I didn't feel anger reading it. I felt distance. Words can be sincere in the moment they are written and still fail over time. That doesn't make them lies, it makes them incomplete. I recycled the card and moved on. I noticed how differently I handled conflict now. I didn't soften my position to keep the peace. I didn't escalate to be heard. I stated my truth plainly and allowed others to respond as they would. That balance had once seemed impossible. Now it felt essential. There were evenings when loneliness brushed past me, light and brief. I didn't panic when it did. Loneliness is not an emergency, it's a signal, and sometimes it simply signals growth. I traveled again, this time with intention rather than escape. I visited places I had postponed because Leonard didn't like them, museums, quiet towns, long train rides where no one expected conversation. I felt present in a way I never had before. When you stop managing someone else's reality, your own becomes vivid. One afternoon, while sitting in a small park far from home, I thought about the box again, about how carefully I had wrapped it, about how calmly I had handed it over. That moment had not been about revenge, it had been about authorship, about deciding how the truth would enter my life. That distinction mattered. I realized then that my greatest act of defiance had been restraint. I hadn't demanded explanations, I hadn't argued timelines, I hadn't begged for remorse. I simply refused to participate in a version of reality that required my silence. That refusal changed everything. As I returned home from that trip, I felt something settle with finality. I was no longer recovering, I was living. The difference is subtle but profound. Recovery looks backward to understand. Living looks forward to create. If someone had told me years ago that patience could coexist with power, I might not have believed them. Power, I thought, had to be loud, immediate, decisive. I know better now. Power can wait. It can observe. It can choose its moment without apology. The story of my marriage no longer feels unfinished. It feels complete, not because it ended well, but because it ended honestly. That is more than any story can hope for. And when I think about that birthday now, I no longer see shock or betrayal as the defining elements. I see composure, preparation, self-respect. I see a woman who waited until the truth walked in on its own, then stood up to meet it without flinching. That woman is still me, and I am grateful to her every day. There comes a moment, long after the dust settles, when you stop checking the horizon for what might return. That was where I found myself at last, not vigilant, not guarded, just present. The past had finished explaining itself, and the future no longer felt like something I needed to defend against. It felt like space, open and honest space. I no longer rehearsed my story before telling it. In fact, I rarely told it at all. When people learned pieces of it, they reacted with the familiar mix of sympathy and awe, and I would gently redirect the conversation, not because I was ashamed, but because I was done living inside that moment. Healing, I discovered, reaches its final stage when your pain no longer needs witnesses. The box itself sat on a shelf in the closet for a long time after everything ended. Empty, unremarkable, just cardboard and faded silver paper. One afternoon, while cleaning, I took it down and turned it over in my hands. It had once held the weight of a lifetime. Now it weighed almost nothing. I recycled it without ceremony. Symbols, like scars, don't need to be preserved forever to be honored. Life continued in small, meaningful ways. Morning routines I loved, evenings that felt unhurried, conversations where I said what I meant and meant what I said. I had built a life that required no explanation, and that felt like the greatest luxury of all. I occasionally wondered who I might have been if Leonard had told the truth 30 years earlier. That curiosity no longer carried regret, it carried acceptance. We don't become ourselves in spite of our experiences. We become ourselves through them. Timing, however imperfect, shapes us all. One afternoon, I received a message from Eliza. She had graduated. She thanked me for something I hadn't realized I'd given her. "You showed me that dignity doesn't have to be loud," she wrote. I read that line several times. If nothing else came from my patience, from my restraint, from my silence that eventually learned to speak, that alone would have been enough. I thought about Margaret, too, about the parallel life she had lived, believing in a version of the truth that had been edited for her comfort. We never became friends, and we didn't need to, but I held no resentment. We had both survived the same storm from different sides. Survival doesn't require comparison. Leonard became, finally, just a man from my past. Not a villain, not a lesson, just someone whose choices intersected with mine for a time and then didn't. That neutrality was the clearest sign of closure. Indifference is not cruelty, it's freedom. When people ask me now what I would do differently, I answer carefully. I wouldn't tell my younger self to leave sooner. I wouldn't tell her to confront more aggressively. I would tell her to listen to herself sooner, to trust the quiet signals, to understand that peace built on silence is not peace at all. There's a misconception that strength requires confrontation in the moment of discovery, that if you don't explode, you've somehow failed yourself. I am living proof that this is not true. Strength can look like waiting, like preparing, like choosing your moment not for maximum damage, but for maximum clarity. On my birthday now, I celebrate differently. I don't mark time by what I've endured, but by what I've reclaimed. I light a candle, I sit with myself, I take stock of my life honestly without judgment, and I am grateful, not for the betrayal, but for the awakening it forced. If you're listening to this and you're holding a truth you're not ready to speak yet, know this: silence is only dangerous when it becomes surrender. Waiting, when done with intention, is not weakness, it is wisdom gathering its strength. You don't owe the world your reaction, you owe yourself your integrity. That day when my husband brought a family he had hidden for 30 years into my living room and called it honesty, I smiled. Not because I forgave him, not because I accepted what he had done, but because I knew something he didn't. I knew I was ready. The box I gave him wasn't an ending, it was a return to myself, to truth, to a life that no longer required me to disappear to keep it intact. And that is where this story ends. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in clarity, in dignity, and in a quiet, unshakable peace that no one can take from me again.